Boa noite a todos. Muito obrigada para quem ficou até a última sessão do dia. Então, agora, para encerrar o tópico de hoje, eu tenho o prazer de apresentar para vocês o Graham Stanley. Ele é líder de programas de inglês no British Council para as Américas, tem mestrado em ELT e tecnologia educacional e já ganhou prêmios por seus dois primeiros manuais para professores, Digital Play, Computer Games and Language Apps e Language Learning with Technology. O último livro do Graham foi Remote Teaching, publicado pelo British Council em 2019. A sessão de agora ela é chamada de Criando Salas de Aula Inclusivas, Estratégias para EDI no Ensino da Língua Inglesa. Bem-vindo, Graham.
Hello, my name is Graham Stanley, and I am the Teacher Development Lead for the British Council. And today I'm going to be talking about creating inclusive classrooms, strategies for EDI in English language teaching. Now, one of the areas the British Council has identified as requiring greater attention and understanding is helping teachers teach students with special educational needs. As a result, the British Council commissioned research on how best to support teaching of special educational needs, SEN, in ELT. This research was carried out by LearnJam in the UK and led to the development of a 7-module toolkit to help teachers create a more inclusive teaching and learning environment. The focus was on teaching online, but the toolkit has advice that is just as relevant for teachers teaching face-to-face, which I hope you will see today. After briefly presenting the rationale and the outcomes of the research and explaining how that led to the decision to develop a toolkit for teachers, I will work through one of the modules, how to differentiate learning, which is module 6, which introduces a flexible approach to differentiation aimed at promoting learner autonomy and boosting engagement, enhancing motivation to learn. So let me talk first about the background to this. As I said before, LearnJam was the consultancy in the UK that did the research. Many of the learners that teachers work with have special educational needs or disabilities, SEND. And it was clear that we needed to support teachers with support resources and knowledge. So we commissioned research first into special educational needs and disabilities. We wanted to identify priority areas to support the teachers working in the public sector by making classes more inclusive for all learners. And the consultancy LearnJam suggested a toolkit containing practical guidance for teachers. We developed the prototype for the toolkit a few years ago, and then the year after, the complete toolkit. Now, the research findings were interesting. Few teachers are trained in supporting needs of learners with special educational needs and disabilities. It was found also that teachers express a need for concrete, practical support, as well as change in mindset and approach. Many of the challenges reported by the teachers were not specific to learners with SEND. For example, low motivation, low ability to focus. These were all challenges that many students in the teacher's classroom might have had. Learners and teachers at secondary level, it was believed that would particularly benefit from inclusive approaches. And we did publish the research report and the conclusions, and there is a link to it, which I can share later. So the concept development, let me talk a little bit about that now. The research findings determined the appropriate focus for the toolkit was to support secondary level teachers in ways of engaging all learners rather than focus on a specific technique or a specific educational need. So we commissioned this toolkit to focus on helping teachers create an inclusive learning environment in their classroom, rather than focus on weaknesses or deficits or specific educational needs. The toolkit was framed as a series of practical, inclusive teaching strategies that teachers could also use immediately. And one thing that is important was that the teachers needed a mindset shift, which is an important learning outcome of the toolkit, in order to understand how to provide a more inclusive environment in their classrooms. So now let's look at the toolkit for inclusive teaching strategies. As you can see here, there are 7 modules. Module 1 was all about why do we need inclusive teaching strategies. It was a rationale, an argument for making classrooms more inclusive. That was followed by Module 2, how to manage the environment for everybody. Module 3, how to give inclusive instructions. Module 4, how to set up inclusive interactions. Module 5, how to better present information for different needs. Module 6, which is the one I'm going to look at in more detail today, how to differentiate learning. And although it was focused on online, you'll see, I hope, that it talks about differentiation in general as well. So it's just as relevant for face-to-face classes. And then finally, Module 7 was how to build belonging online. And that was pretty much specific to the online environment. Now, the interesting thing about this toolkit is that you don't have to work from Module 1 to Module 7. You can approach it in any way you like. You can just look at the module that most interests you as most relevant to your own context and your own classroom. It's also designed to be self-access, so you can work through the modules on your own, but there are also discussion questions, so you can actually get together with the teachers, either face-to-face or online, and work through a module and talk about it. And a trainer can also take the toolkit and present it and as a workshop, or as I'm doing today, present one of the modules as a thing to work through. So let's start by looking at the module 6, how to differentiate learning online, from the toolkit, which introduces a flexible approach to differentiation and is aimed at promoting learner autonomy and boosting engagement and enhancing motivation to learn. Although the toolkit, as I said, is aimed at remote teachers, I'm going to apply it today to teachers in the face-to-face classroom too. So this is the beginning. There are 6 sections to the module. It starts with an introduction. Then it goes to Principle 1, the content, what learners learn, followed by Principle 2, the process of how learners learn, and then Principle 3, the product, how learners demonstrate their understanding of the knowledge or skills. So there are 3 principles in this module about differentiation, which I'll look at today. And then the module looks at how to apply the strategies and make some suggestions about how you, the teacher, can put it into practice. So each of the modules, as does this one, starts with a case study to really show how this is rooted in the practice of teaching. And let's look briefly at this case study. So this is a student called Sandra, and Sandra is extremely frustrated with school. And let's see if you have any students in your class like Sandra. Now, although Sandra makes some effort to study, she's still falling behind. So she's not keeping up with the rest of the students. And right now, Sandra is very stressed as she has a written exam tomorrow. But the only learning materials available to Sandra are her textbooks, which are too hard for her. They're above her reading level, and she also has her own notes, but these notes are poorly written and poorly organized. So this is a typical situation that you might find with one of your students. And it's a situation that leads to a lot of frustration. And it also shows that it's not necessary to have someone with a disability or a particularly identified special educational need for there to be the need for differentiation or for extra attention, which is the case with Sandra. Right, so let's look, as the case study suggests, why we need to differentiate online learning. And this is where I'm going to ask you to write in the chat. So I would like answers to the following questions, whatever you think is appropriate. What do you think differentiation entails? So what is differentiation? What do you need to do to differentiate in your classroom, differentiate between the learners? And then the second question I would like you to answer, just whatever your thoughts are, just pop something in the chat, is why do we need to differentiate learning? Why is it necessary? And I look forward to reading the comments that you write in the chat. While you're doing that, or as you're doing that, let's look at some of the answers that the toolkit provides. Differentiation means adjusting your lessons for the different needs of your learners. Differentiation could involve changing the content, delivery, or methods of learning to ensure that every person learns in the way that works for them. So that's what differentiation is about. It's about giving options to the students, not just teaching or asking them to learn in one particular way, giving them additional options, differentiating with what you do in the classroom or what they're able to do as a learner. And differentiation in teaching is important because this one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. Students are different, as we all know, and some students need additional help, and other students need different ways to approach the material that we are teaching. So, are you ready to start? Again, if you want to add something in the chat, that would be really useful. I would like you to think about these 3 questions. You could just think about them or write some answers to one of them in the chat if you like. What inclusive strategies do you already use? Is differentiation something that you're familiar with? And how do you differentiate in your classroom? If not, what do you think you may need to change? Think about the way that you teach and the material that you teach and your students. What do you think you may need to change in your classroom to make it more inclusive? What improvements can you make to making more inclusive practice in your classroom, be it online or face-to-face? What do you think you can do to make your classroom more inclusive? Either just reflect on those for a moment, or, as I said before, if you want to put some answers in the chat, that would be great. I'm sure everybody watching this webinar will benefit from your ideas. So let's look at principle 1, the content. This is what the learners learn. What is this principle? So often our learning material consists of reading and content-heavy presentations. Differentiating content means providing different ways to access the learning material. By having different options, for example, slides with text, links to video clips, audio recordings, and graphics, learners can choose how they learn. And the first step when considering how to differentiate in the classroom is to get to know the students in your classroom. One way to do this is to interview your learners about their favorite ways of learning and how confident they feel completing certain tasks. The more you know your learners, the better you're able to help them with their learning. And if you want to do something related to this later, then think back to your last lesson. What percentage of the learning content was written? Was it a lot? And what percentage was audio? If you think about that, reflect on it, and then it will be important to see what you feel about this by the end of the webinar. Right, so how does this benefit our learners? So providing differentiation, a variety of ways to access information. Learners who struggle with phonological processing, for example, don't need to only rely on written texts for comprehension. So it's important not just to provide texts that are in writing. So let's look at principle 1, the content. On a scale of 1 to 10, how good are you at accessing and understanding printed text? Number 1, not good. Number 10, very good. Put something in the chat. Think about how you are as a learner in accessing and understanding printed text. Now, imagine if you had given yourself a score of 1, how would you feel in your most recent lesson? And what could you do to make the lesson more inclusive? Was it text heavy? So strategy 1, you can vary the way you present information in class. For example, online, you can include screenshots and images throughout a presentation for visual aids. And you can engage learners with your voice, your body language, and by using real-life objects where appropriate. So this is the advice the toolkit gives for teachers teaching online. What about the face-to-face classroom? Well, it is similar. If you have a projector, you can make sure you combine images and not just use words. If using a blackboard or a whiteboard, use drawings as well as words. Pin photos and other images to the board or hand them out, if that's possible. How can you apply this in your classroom? Strategy number 2. Well, online, you could try recording a video of yourself presenting what was previously written content so that learners can read, see, and hear the presentation. And these presentations can be reusable for future classes too. So even though it takes time, you can use them with other classes. Being able to access a video before or after your session will have added benefits for the learners who need adjustments to pace and schedule. And as before, this could be a suggestion for the online classroom. This is a suggestion for the online classroom, but what about the face-to-face classroom? Well, make sure you read whatever you write on the board, as I'm doing here, or present using a projector. Try describing any images you use. If your students have use of a platform before or after class, you can upload the material there. A video, for example, is suggested here. And if not, you could consider giving photocopies before a class to students who need extra time to engage with the material. Principle 2, let's move on to the process. Let's look at how learners learn. What is this principle? Well, how do your different learners understand or make sense of information, ideas, and skills? This principle is about considering different learning paces and preferences and adapting the digital learning environment accordingly. Or if you're teaching face-to-face, the face-to-face classroom, adapting your face-to-face classroom. Some learners pick things up quickly. Some learners pick things up quickly while others need more time. And often in a traditional classroom, tasks are completed in a set amount of time, which can mean faster learners can feel held up and a little bit bored, and slower learners can feel rushed. Every learner comes with their own preference for engaging with tasks. Some learners enjoy consolidating learning by discussing an idea, while others prefer to touch and explore concepts physically. Some prefer to work in groups, while others need time for independent study. And some students require more support of a teacher. So there are lots of things you can do to help the process. can you make a note of the following question? Do all learners in your class or your classes work at the same pace? What do you think? I would be surprised if you say yes to that. So how does this reflection on the process benefit our learners? Well, using a flexible approach to the process of learning gives learners more autonomy over their learning. It also helps send students feel like they're not falling behind or holding the lesson up, which can reduce their confidence and self-esteem. Now, let's discuss principle 2, the process. Again, in the chat, I would like you to put your answers to these 2 questions. The first question is, what are some of the challenges of differentiating the process in your specific context? So if you teach online, or if you teach in a face-to-face classroom, if you use technology, if you have a blackboard, a whiteboard, does the classroom have fixed chairs, etc., etc.? Think about your space, how you learn, your context, and what are the challenges in differentiating the process with your specific context. And what are the benefits? What do you think are the benefits? Would the benefits be, or are the benefits of differentiating this process in your specific context? Write your ideas in the chat. Would love to see them, and I'm sure everyone will benefit from reading what you have to share as well. So let's look at 3 strategies. Strategy 1, for the online classroom, you can set work to be asynchronous. In other words, you don't have to do it in a live online classroom. Now, in the face-to-face classroom, you could consider using the flipped classroom approach, which means you give students material to look at before they come to class. So think about what you're going to do in class and give the students some material to look at. Those who need the extra time can spend time looking at this material. It could be reading, it could be something to listen to, etc. And they can engage with the material beforehand, and that gives them enough time on their own before they come to class to engage with it, and they will appreciate it, I'm sure, having that time. Those who don't need the time to look at it before class, well, they don't have to. Strategy number 2, provide space for collaborating with other learners in groups. So making time to give students the opportunity to engage with other students in groups is always a good thing. It changes the dynamic for the class, but it also gives them an opportunity to share with other learners. And strategy 3, online, you can use breakout rooms, or if you're teaching a physical class, you can use stations. Now, station work is this idea of splitting students into groups and setting different tasks in different parts of the classroom for each group, while you monitor or provide additional time for those who need it. It's a very good idea. You can set sort of 10 minutes per task or 5 minutes per task, depending on the task. And then once those 5 or 10 minutes are up, the students change and they move on to the next station. One of the stations could be talking to you, for example, which gives them an opportunity to practice their speaking. And you can also allow learners to choose a station depending on how they want to interact with the material. So it doesn't have to be that all learners have to interact in the same way in different. Principle number 3, the product. So let's look at the 3rd principle. How do learners demonstrate their understanding of the knowledge or skills? And before we begin this section, I'd like you to think about this quote. Do you agree with it? Again, put agree or don't agree in the chat. You can put some reasons if you want. Everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. What do you think of that quote? So what is this principle? The product, or what learners produce, refers to how learners demonstrate their understanding of knowledge or a skill. For each task, you can offer more than one way in which learners can show their understanding. For example, do you just use a test to show that if students have understood something? A multiple choice test, is it always the same? Well, consider thinking about doing things in a different way. For example, for a given task, you could give learners a choice to write an essay or prepare a slide deck or create a website. That might be a bit difficult, or submit a video or submit an audio recording, depending on their skills and preference. If you give some options, you might be surprised that students decide to do things in a different way than what you're used to. How does this benefit our learners? Well, offering different ways to demonstrate understanding benefits both learners and teachers by leading to a greater sense of ownership or product. It also allows learners to use their strengths and further helps build the confidence of special educational needs learners by not forcing them to do what they're less able to do. Now, let's discuss principle 3, the product. Again, in the chat, write some answers to this and read what everyone else has to say. What could you do to change what you ask students to produce to make your classroom more inclusive? As I said before, do you always ask students to do a test at the end of a module or at the end of the unit? How could you do it differently? And then if you do have access to technology, either if in the classroom or if you're working online, how could technology help you with this? Is there a way that the students could use technology like audio recording or video recording in your classroom context to do something a bit differently, to produce something? Now, let's look at 2 strategies. One example is the students can present work visually in a slide deck or on a platform like Jamboard. Unfortunately, Jamboard is being discontinued, but it refers to a way of sharing on a document. A Google Doc could be used instead, for example, or Flipgrid. Flipgrid is a way of uploading a video and then having other people to comment on the video. So these are 2 ideas if you have access to technology, or if the students have access to technology outside of the classroom. I'm sure you can think of other ways that you can do it in the classroom as well. Strategy number 2, you could ask the students to submit an audio or a video recording, answering the assignment using software like Loom. Look up Loom. I think you'll find it interesting if it is something that you think students would have access to. Strategy number 3, well, you can do group work either offline or outside of class, or within the class, where learners take on roles related to their strengths. So you could have a discussion where one of the learners is a note taker, or a debate where one of the learners moderates the debate, for example. Strategy number 4, give learners the option to hand in an offline assignment or to do something outside of the classroom, so they can take more time than they would if they were doing it in the classroom under the pressure of doing something within 10 minutes, 15 minutes, etc. So, for example, they could complete a hands-on activity with materials from their home, and they could take a photo, or they could produce something. You could set a little project for them. There are all sorts of things you can do once you start thinking about it and how you can differentiate. I do recommend you think about your own context and think about what you have available, what the learners have available, and then start deciding of how you can help them, give them more opportunities, and ask them to do something which perhaps is a bit different to what they're used to doing or what you're used to asking them to do. Now, again, if you have access to technology, there are some interesting new tools, if you can get hold of them, or if the student can get hold of them, which can help you. Speech to text tools are very useful. I don't know if you've come across any of those. They're particularly helpful for learners who forget their ideas once they shift to writing. So you can have students now, they could speak into their mobiles, they can speak into their computers, and Google Docs will do that. Word will do this, for example, and the the software, once you enable it, will turn your audio, your speaking, into text. It'll write a transcript for you. And that could be very useful to introduce to learners who are used to speaking, who enjoy speaking, but perhaps have difficulty writing, for example. Now, learners who struggle with getting any words on the page at all, unable to transfer their thoughts, well, they could speak into the microphone of a device if they have access to it and have the text come out. You could even have them do it in their own language first, and then have them translate it either automatically or on their own, which is another great exercise in itself. Learners who are anxious about their spelling and grammar, for example, might find this of particular value. So now, what I would like to do is, in an ideal world, I'd have you discuss this if we were all together in a group. But I think you can come up with some ideas to put in the chat, I think is the best that we can do. So what about this? How can you find out from your learners about what works best for them? I already suggested that perhaps you could interview them. But what other ways could you find out from your learners? What do you think? Write your ideas in the chat and then look at what everybody is sharing. I'm going to suggest a couple. For example, apart from the interviews that you could have with your learners, you could ask the learners to interview each other. You could have them design a survey and they could record it, they could write it up, or they could present it as a little report afterwards based on that. You could have learners survey the whole class, or you could have them just survey a partner and then share everything in a publication, for example. That is one way you could do it. What other ways can you think of? And then finally, I think it's very important for all of us as teachers to think about your own context when it comes to all of these suggestions about differentiation, and to think about an activity. This is a good exercise. Think about an activity that you're planning, that you know you're going to do with the class next week, for example, this week, tomorrow, whenever you have time, and make some notes about this. You don't have to do this now. This is something you can do later. And think about the way that you were planning to do it, and then take some time and think about what changes you can make in order to differentiate the content. So is there anything you think you might want to do with the content to change the what the learners are learning, to make it more inclusive, to differentiate for some of the students, which by now you should know very well in your classroom? What about the process? Think about how your learners are learning. Are there some learners falling behind? Are there some learners who are too quick? Can you give additional challenges to the learners who are too quick? Can you do anything about how the learners are presented the material, how they're learning, in order to give their learners who are falling behind more time to do that? The flipped classroom approach, for example, can you give some of the material before the learners come to class so they have more time to think about it? And those who need it can spend more time in reading or processing or listening before you actually do anything in classroom. Is that something you can do? Can you provide the listening material, the reading material, the listening material on a platform, for example? Is there a way of being able to provide the learners the reading, at the very least, photocopies of the reading or some of the instructions, etc., exercises that they can look through? And then you could actually start by asking the learners if they had any trouble or if they have any questions with what they looked at. And those who are quick or who didn't look at the material beforehand will need to read it there and then at the beginning, just before you do the exercises. And those who did it beforehand will come equipped with their notes, and they will benefit from that. And then finally, the product. How do learners demonstrate the understanding of knowledge or skills in your classroom? Think about an activity that you're going to do. Could you do anything a bit different? Could you give them an option? Could you ask them to do what you ask them to demonstrate what they know once you've finished the activity in different ways? Could you give them options? Think about it. And that brings me to the end of this presentation, Creating Inclusive Classroom Strategies for EDI and English Language Teaching. And I would recommend that you download the entire toolkit, and you'll see that I've just worked through module number 6, differentiating learning. So you can have the material that I've looked at for yourself. There is a bit more than what I've done today. You can look at it on your own. I recommend you also perhaps look at it with other groups of teachers if you can, to have a discussion. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I think you can put them in the chat. And I am hoping to join you online after this presentation to be able to answer them. Or I'll keep an eye on the recording if you're listening to a recording, and see if you have any questions. I can come back and answer those too. Thank you very much.
Interessante, Graham. Pessoal do público, Graham's here with us, so I'm changing to English to make the questions you did in the chat if you want to ask some more. Hi, Graham. Nice seeing you again. Long time no see.
Hi, Vanessa. Hi, everyone. Yes, it's been a while. How are you?
Very good, good. Thank you. Graham, let me see. It's not exactly a question, but one of the teachers said that unfortunately, many times the classes are bigger than they would like to have. And I would like to know if you have some tips. This happens a lot in Brazil, especially in public schools. We have like very crowded classrooms. If you have any tips to use the material in these cases.
Yes, it's very common, I think, for teachers to have very large classes in Brazil and in other countries in our region, and indeed around the world. And it is difficult. The more students you have, of course, the more difficult it is. Now, this also means that it's likely that most of your students have different needs, in which case it makes it more difficult to cater to their specific needs. So I think some of the things that I talked about related to differentiation are important. If you can split the students up into groups and do station work, for example, and that means giving a part, doing a cycle, so having perhaps 10 minutes for each station in different parts of the classroom, then you can give more individual attention to students, because you can be one of those stations, and you can either concentrate on speaking or doing a particular activity where you're monitoring that group of students. Now, I do realize that isn't always possible, because if you have a small classroom and not a very big classroom with a lot of students in it, then that it's not possible for you to actually split up the classroom in that way. So the other way of doing it is really to try to give support to the students before class, for example. So the idea of trying to give them some material to look at beforehand so they know what to expect. And that can also help them prepare themselves for class. Now, again, depending on the age of the student, that is either feasible or not. But there are, it's very difficult to generalize about what a teacher can do when faced with a very large class of students. A lot depends on physical space, on the nature of the students, on the range of levels of English, for example, that the students have in the class. But those are some ideas anyway.
Sorry, Graham was muted. Thank you. At the same point about realities of Brazilian public schools, the material is amazing and I see you have many ideas for classroom, but can you also give us some tips for cases where the curriculum is a bit fixed, not so many flexibility?
Yes, of course. I think that's the important thing. With this type of toolkit, it's very difficult to actually provide um, enough ideas for teachers that will fit every situation or circumstance. But I think it's written in such a way that you should find something in the toolkit to help you make your classrooms more inclusive. So even if you have a very fixed curriculum that you find it difficult to fit in or have the time to do other things, there are suggestions in the toolkit that should help you work with your curriculum, whatever that is, and your classes and your students. A lot of it is meant to provoke reflection. So if you can reflect on what is your circumstance and how you can adapt your teaching to be more inclusive, that's what this is all about, really. It's about trying to include as many students as possible rather than teaching one particular way, to reflect upon what kind of needs your students may need that are different, really. It's a bit generalized, but I think the key is actually, if you download the toolkit, you have a look at it, I recommend you, if you can, you look at it with other teachers, and that gives you an opportunity to have a discussion. But if that's not the case, where you can go through it yourselves, choose a module like the one I suggested or one of the others, and see if it gives you ideas to help teach.
Thanks, Graham. We don't have other questions. We have a lot of comments here. Thanking you for the awesome presentation and for the material. And there is someone who said it's seen you, other presentations from you. So I'm just gonna ask you to give your last message for teachers from Brazil today, because you have other presentation.
Yes, of course. I just want to thank all of the teachers from Brazil for being here during the day for ELT Week. I think this is the end of the first day of, or this day of ELT Week, not the first day. And I will be back later in the week with a different presentation. I think it's marvelous that so many teachers from Brazil are able to take advantage of a variety of different sessions and subjects, I think, such as this, which look at inclusion, special educational needs, disability in the classroom. It's something that more and more is becoming more important for teachers. And I think I think and I hope you will all get a lot from the toolkit if you take the opportunity to download it and have a look at it. We have spent a lot of time, a lot of thought to try and help your learners and make your classrooms more inclusive. So those are my final words. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham, for your presence.
Pleasure. Thank you, Vanessa, for facilitating. Thank you, everybody behind the scenes, for making it happen.
Oh, it's mute.
You were
Yeah.
muted, Vanessa.
Obrigada a todos por participarem desse segundo dia de ELT Week, por verem todas essas sessões sobre EDI. Por favor, façam um download do toolkit que o Graham recomendou. Deixem os comentários de vocês também, a gente vai olhar depois. Esse toolkit vai estar disponível para download na nossa página, na mesma que vocês fizeram a inscrição. E esperamos vocês amanhã às 9 da manhã para o nosso terceiro dia. E o tema do próximo dia vai ser avaliação do ensino e da aprendizagem. Boa noite.